We've all heard, seen voice sort of getting incorporated slowly and steadily into our interactions with applications and machines. The uh, topic of our webinar today is doing a little bit of that exploration of sort of what that journey has been, where we are today, and sort of how we can sort of take this forward. I'm very, very excited personally, and with me, as Paul mentioned, we've got a very esteemed panel. So I wanted to quickly introduce each one of them. First is Ashutosh Bijoor, global CTO at Accion Labs. He heads all of our innovation at Accion Labs and is responsible for sort of driving the company's technology vision going forward. Also on the panel is Dr. Sophia Makoid. She is an assistant professor of cardioarthritic and vascular surgery at McGovern Medical School. Sophia, comes with multiple years of experience with invasive surgery and presents a great sort of a industry perspective on how voice can potentially leverage or be leveraged in healthcare, especially when it comes to things like physician efficiency again, without going into too many spoiler alerts here, but the idea is how voice can essentially be used to leverage more efficiencies and help improve the work-life balance and patient care. Also on the panel is Joe Makoid. Joe is a territory manager for robotics and digital at SeedSats. Joe comes with a lot of experience in medical equipment technology, and again provides a great industry perspective on sort of where we're going in terms of wearables, voice, and how can all of this integrate together into a great customer experience. So with that, again, like I said, I'm very, very excited to sort of discuss this topic, explore this more. And with that, maybe Ash, I'll probably start with you. So again, I know, human machine and human application interfaces over the years have gotten more complex, more feature rich. We have, responsive user interfaces, great, very complex user interfaces that today, run analytics engines, have workflow automation built in. What I wanted to sort of first explore is, why voice, right? What value does voice bring in above and beyond what we already have today, right? We have web apps, mobile apps, a lot of complex workflows. So maybe I just think we can probably start there. Evolution of voice, and where do you think, sort of voice adds value?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Mikunj, and a good place to start, I guess, because bottom line is we usually take technologies for granted that, when new technologies are enabled, we assume that we just have to use them. And typically, the hype cycles are such they think, okay, touch is out of style, now it's all going to be voice. I think it's still quite early from a technology perspective, but let's just explore the question a little bit. So why do we need to use voice at all? So I think the first aspect of voice is not really voice as much as language. So I want to refocus this word a little bit. It's a bit of a misnomer, because it implies that it's spoken language or voice which is the key to enabling these new features and applications. I think it's language which has enabled, which is the key here, and not necessarily voice. Voice is just spoken language. But the reason for using language as a mechanism for interfacing to applications is largely because human beings, are particularly good at communicating with language. So it's because of human beings. It's not because machines are good at language that we want to use language for applications. It's because human beings find it much easier to communicate either with each other or with systems by using language. Um, of course, we know that language is very, very complex when we communicate. There's a lot of context, there's subtle nuances which evoke emotion, sarcasm, and several other tricks that even human beings find it difficult to understand sometimes. So it's a little bit of a stretch to imagine that all of these nuances can be interpreted by machines. But what has happened, I guess, even though the attempts have been made, and very early on there have been experiments which have been run, which use voice as a way to interact, but they have been really simple interactions, commands, predefined commands, those kind of structured inputs have been possible. But what has really made a big difference is, of course, the maturity of AI-based voice recognition technologies has really matured to an extent where one thing is, of course, the technologies have evolved to a great extent. The second is the amount of training data that you can train such algorithms is also increased. And that's largely because we have so many mobile users, all of them are using voice, and they are helping actually train the backend systems to learn how to interpret voice. So this has really made voice feasible for machines to understand, because classically machines only understand machine language, right? Not too many decades ago, all computers could only understand machine language with nothing but bits and bytes. And it's only now that we have advanced GUIs and those kind of interfaces. So it's a long journey, and we are very, very early still in capabilities of machines to be able to understand human language. But the primary reason for using voice is because humans are good at language. And the other side of this conversation is, what do traditional interfaces, what are the limitations of traditional interfaces that voice can fill those gaps in, right? That's equally important to understand. And we have found that one of the most challenging parts of traditional applications and traditional interfaces is when applications become complex. That means there are too many features, there are lots of different features. Okay, that's one context in which traditional interfaces become more and more challenging, because when the user enters a system and there are hundreds and hundreds of different options that the user can use, or features that the user can use, it's difficult for the user to figure things out using just staid user experience design addresses many of those challenges, but there are limitations in how much you can really present something in the form of a self-service interface that users need to discover what they can do with the system. And so users will find it more easy to just say what they want, and the system should be able to understand what they are looking for. And that's the sort of ideal gap that voice or natural language can fill when applications get complex. And the second, of course, is in terms of structured queries. And systems are good at structured queries, but when we ask for unstructured questions, they are very difficult to answer in traditional interfaces. So these are the two primary gaps, I think, that voice can fill.
Great point, Ash. Very, very interesting perspective that it's humans for whom voice is natural, but not for machines. So it's this is really made for humans and not so much for machines. It's machines who have to sort of train themselves to adjust and accommodate voice into the and like you said, language. Again, there's a distinction between the two. So very interesting perspective. Ash, just building on that a little bit. What kind of applications do you think are therefore probably suited for voice? Are there a certain category of applications, features? Like, how do you look at that? That where voice is a key differentiator.
Well, the low-hanging fruit really is where traditional interfaces are not possible at all, right? Where users are busy doing something else, their hands are occupied with something, like you're driving, the classic use cases, you're driving and then you want to use your mobile phone, and rather than using touch, you should be able to use voice and say, hey, give me directions, what's the fastest way back home, right? And you should be able to get an answer. Those are the simple use cases where your hands are busy and so traditional interfaces are difficult to use. That's where you would use voice. So that's a straightforward matter. But I also mentioned about complex applications. So I think there is the key, if you look at what Google did to search, right? They just replaced complex search queries that previous search engines had with a simple input box. And so just ask any question and Google should be able to answer it. Just imagine if applications were able to understand complex commands by just having users ask questions to traditional applications, right? I think that's the real opportunity we have to allow traditional applications to just understand what humans beings want by just asking, allowing them to ask questions. And systems should be able to answer those questions, but not necessarily. I think that's the key. I also want to point out that the common perception of voice applications is chatbots, right? And I want to bust that myth that chatbots is the only way in which you can use voice in your applications. Chatbots is great in certain situations where there is a structured queries that users can ask. But it's very frustrating that, for users when they ask questions that chatbots cannot answer. And creating that expectation in the user that this is actually almost like a intelligent bot, and we call it a bot and we call it intelligent and we call it artificial intelligence, and we hype it up to such an extent that users start expecting magically that the system is going to be able to answer questions like a human being. It's not capable of doing that. And so rather than in a chatbot context, if we turn that around and say computers are good at graphical interfaces, so let human beings ask questions in natural language and let applications respond using what they are good at, right? In terms of graphical interfaces and pictures and graphics and graphs and reports and stuff like that. So I think those are the kind of ideas that will really give us the value in terms of using voice in applications, rather than only restricting it to chatbots. Chatbots a great idea, by the way. I'm not saying that it's not, but that's not the only thing that you can do with voice.
Got it. Just building on your idea of search, Microsoft launched Bing, and there were many other search tools that were available prior to Google. In fact, some people even say Google today, when you ask a query, returns back 7 million pages, right? But not necessarily a direct answer to your question sometimes. It's sometimes seen as a limiting factor. When you look at voice, does it really work? I mean, is it very seamless? Does it actually make the user experience frictionless? Or are there limitations of voice today? And what are they?
Mikunj, if you don't mind, I would like to get a little bit of perspective from Sophia and Joe on what other applications, in industries like healthcare and other industries. But I think I've been talking quite a bit, and I'd like a little bit of change in the voice. And let's also get perspectives from Sophia and Joe on, I think, what kind of applications they can think of as far as voice is concerned, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So, Sophia, you want to maybe take that one? What's your perspective on the role voice has and probably can play in healthcare when it comes to things like improvement of patient care, efficiencies, everything I was talking about earlier in the introduction.
So, hello everyone. So interestingly enough, when you guys first brought this webinar up to me, I tried to think of all the ways that we use voice in healthcare today. And the truth of the matter is that it's not really being used to the capabilities or for the potential that is out there. Hospitals don't use voice the way that other companies use voice. For example, you can go to your house and Alexa can turn on your lights or set your oven on and do things like that. But hospitals haven't made that jump to using voice-activated systems. And there's a big market for it out there for people to develop software and hardware that's going to make things easier to do. Right now, I mean, the most that I've ever seen is people are limited to, we have cars that can drive, themselves, but we still have surgeons who are using loop recorders to record their dictations. And there's just a big, vast field. And we're growing a millennial generation where, you know, kids are given iPhones at younger ages and they use Alexa. You know, 2-year-olds know how to put their favorite song on their Alexa, and when they grow up to become members of healthcare or everything else, we're creating this generation of people who know how to use voice-activated systems. And so I think healthcare has to make a very large leap to kind of catch up with where everyone else already is.
That's
great.
Bijoor.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, any your perspective on sort of voice and how it sort of pertains into you know, robotics, wearables, the medical equipment space?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mikunj. So, I mean, I think about it from a broad perspective of healthcare, and I've had the, you know, good fortune of being in this, you know, specifically in the surgery space for almost 10 years now. And yeah, I love to tell the story. One of my first days with J&J as a sales rep, going into the operating room, and I, you know, assumed, wow, surgery, this is going to be super high tech. You know, this is the cream of the crop. And it couldn't have been more of the opposite when I walked in. It felt like it was 1975 when I walked in the operating room. Big cumbersome hardware. Digital was like, it's not even really understood. What does that even mean? I mean, there's really very limited software technology. So it got me really thinking, and it made me very passionate about how do we bring the entire healthcare ecosystem into 2020 when it comes to digitization. Industries, you know, the financial industry, tech, obviously are so far ahead of us. And there's good reason for that, right? Healthcare is heavily regulated for you know, a lot of good reason, and data is very protected, but there's so much opportunity to innovate. It's so ripe for innovation when you think about the, you know, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and then within that, when we start talking about natural language processing and the voice technology that you can build off of that. I work a lot with surgeons, and they don't have time to, you know, go to the bathroom some days. You know, they're so busy, and I think constantly about how do we build frictionless technology that can just drop into their lives, right? That they no longer have to spend time behind a computer. I mean, you know, Sophia can give a firsthand perspective. She trained for 12 years to learn how to cut, sew, place stents, you know, do this really advanced, take great care of patients. She spends probably 50% of her time behind a computer, charting, dictating. And it's unfortunate in one respect. It's unfortunate today, but the opportunist in me says it's actually fortunate, right? Because that means there's an incredible opportunity for bright minds to innovate in this space. And it's, like I said, something that I've just grown super passionate about. So that's a little bit of a broad healthcare perspective when it comes to digitization. But voice, I think the opportunity is I think the great thing about voice is it's frictionless for the end user. I think that's the key, right? How do you drop it into their daily lives to allow them to be more efficient?
Absolutely.
I'll add on to that a little bit as well, is that, like Joe said, there's a lot of times, and Ash also mentioned this, you know, there's a lot of times where I'm using both of my hands, and I wish we make the jokes like, oh, if you could do this with your third arm, like, can you do this with your third arm? And I'm like, you know, even being able to pick up my phone in the operating room, it would be great if I could say, like, you know, my phone goes off, it's either, you know, a nurse trying to get a hold of me or another physician trying to get a hold of me, but I'm, you know, scrubbed in, I can't touch my phone. It would be great if I could say, you know, Siri, pick up my phone, and, you know, that makes that application, or having some kind of hardware in the operating room that could pick up my phone for me, because a lot of times I'm limited with, you know, the touch capability of things. Or, you know, just a couple of days ago, I was helping a patient do something, and I needed a hand there, and I wish I could have just, you know, if the room had like a capability, like a speaker that I could be like, hey, please call, you know, the nurse for, you know, room 130. So instead I was holding a patient's leg and shouting outside the room, and I had 7 nurses come in rushing because they thought it was an emergency. And I was like, I needed a tissue for this patient's leg. So there are opportunities to build structures, and it's going to happen, you know, whether, you know, we can have this conversation today, but in 10 years, we're all going to look back and remember this webinar and be like, oh my God, like, we were talking about that technology then, and look at how far we've come. People are making the strides, like Joe was saying. It's really interesting to see, you know, you just Google things and you see what people are doing in healthcare. And someday you're going to have, you know, you're going to be voice active, you're going to be doing a surgery, and it'd be great for like, oh, you know, what's the best stent to use in this? Or you can ask, you know, an assistant a question like, hey, what's the patency rate, or, you know, how long will this stent stay open if I use this stent over this stent? And, you know, a voice activated thing will say, oh, this is how long this stent will last. You'll be better off using this stent instead. And that is really where it's going to come in the next, you know, 10, 15 years, if there's going to be a voice activated search engine that's going to be available for us.
Absolutely. No, this is great, you know, sort of perspective. Um, so from a technology perspective, maybe Ash, if I could come back to you. Uh, so we're hearing from the industry that, you know, only if some of these features were available, you know, life would be great. Voice integrated in a seamless way could make, you know, Joe, using your terms, make the entire customer experience more frictionless. Well, then what is the challenge? I mean, where is voice today technologically in terms of integrating that into our applications? And are there any limitations or challenges?
Yeah, I think rather than answer that question merely from a theoretical perspective, I want to give some examples. I'm sure all of us have experienced, you know, smart speakers like Alexa and Google Home. We may also have experienced chatbots, which are typically, you know, pop-up windows and applications or websites which simulate or try to simulate a human being's conversation with a user. But I want to give you a couple of examples which are not usual examples. And if you allow me to share my screen, I will run through just a couple of simple examples to illustrate non-standard voice interfaces, so if you don't mind. So let me just share my screen and show you a traditional web-based application. And let me know if you're able to see this. This is an internal application we use for recruitment in Accion. And, you know, it's got the standard stuff. You know, it's got menus and it's got dashboards and analytics and forms to enter data and all that stuff. But the key is, you know, if I want some quick answers, typically I would do a search, right? And structured search is difficult to do because where do I find, let's say, find all Python developers? So this is, you know, these are simple queries, right? You could have, you can argue that this could have been done with traditional search. So why do you really need voice, right? But you can do other things as well. So create a new requirement for a Java developer in Mumbai. So if you look at this, it has created, you know, now as a user, I don't know how I create a new requirement, right? Do I go and click on this menu of requirements and there's some add button there and so on and so forth. And you can imagine this is a relatively simple application, but when you have large applications with like hundreds of menu options and hundreds of different reports and all of this, for a user to be able to navigate through that mess, you know, and figure things out, despite however so-called user-friendly you make it, it's just not feasible. So it should be possible, relatively easy, to make it easy to you know, train your applications to start understanding human language of this kind. So let's take another example. Find all candidates with name Aurora. Now, I'm not going to be using only voice, so I can still do my traditional stuff. I can open this stuff and read the content and read whatever it is. But let's say now I want to be able to do, call this candidate for an interview at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Right. So if you look at this, what we have done is there is, you know, it's almost like you're speaking to a human being, but it's the structure. So the application is not trying to behave like a human being. The application still behaves like an application, right? But I am talking to the application. So I think the real power of voice is to allow human beings to talk using natural language and applications to respond the way they are good at responding, right? Showing reports, showing us. So now just imagine if you force the application to talk through all the list of Python developers, it's like silly, right? Why would an application respond and read out an entire list of Python developers? It should just show the list, right? So I think we are a little bit myopic in our perspective in how voice is used in applications. Let me give you another example. These examples are largely, data requests, right? That you're actually searching for things. The other very common requirement is data entry, because we have to enter a large amount of data in traditional applications. So this is still a little bit work in progress. So, you have to bear with the limitations of what this can do right now, but it'll illustrate to you, that how far the technology is already matured and what it can do. So here are a list of sample forms, right? And suppose you have a form like, let's say, an employment application. It's a relatively simple form. And traditionally, what I would have to do is to fill in this form using, my keyboard and all of that stuff. And even traditional, voice enablement of forms requires you to click on a mic icon next to every input and then, allow you to speak. But what if I could just say, have a single button and say, let's say, like Sophia is doing, inspecting or talking to a patient, and then all she wants to do is to record her notes. You should be able to just say, start a transcription. Brad Pitt. Next. 773-245-6671. Next. Next. Single. Go to comments. Go to comments. Please give me this job. I desperately need the money. Done. So as you can see, bottom line is, this is just, the technology is there, right? It's just our imagination that is limiting us from using it. There's no rocket science in using voice like this, okay? The technologies are available, they're accessible. There are, Google engines. Google provides on Google Cloud a voice recognition or transcription engine. Amazon provides one. The challenge is really two things. One is, if you want to be able to use applications like this, the bottom line is that our applications need to be able to understand context. Okay, the most difficult thing to get in an application is for applications to understand context of the query that a human being is making. And the limitations of most of current applications are that all our data in traditional applications are in silos, and they're not really connected to each other. So you may have, one aspect of the user in one side of the application, and another aspect of the user in another silo of the application, and the two are not connected. So the bottleneck to using voice is not really voice. It's just that your applications are not ready, to be able to allow users to ask real questions. And of course, initiatives like, putting a data lake behind the scene, allowing, indexing of all your data, all of those are sort of health-wise requirements before you even imagine that your applications can start using voice. So the limitations need not be technical limitations. They're just limitations of technical debt that applications have currently, to be able to prepare themselves for really making it easy to use voice for users. So similar to that, you can imagine that this kind of interface can be applied to any application, right? There's no limit on, you can do voice-based navigation, you can do voice-based data entry, you can ask queries, they can be structured queries. Now, what are the limitations in all of this? The limitations from a technical perspective is that when you want to do structured queries, all the queries have to be trained. Just like I asked a question, show me all Python developers. And if I did not train the system to interpret what I'm saying, and when I say I what do I mean by Python developers, right? That there's certain amount of training that is required for structured queries. For transcription is relatively easier because all you're doing is transcribing voice into text, even though you need to be able to understand specialized vocabulary. So I think that the two types of applications that are possible and very easy to integrate in traditional applications is voice-based structured commands, which can be navigation commands, they can be search queries, they can be data entry, simple data entry queries, or transcription-based is the second type of voice integration. And the challenge in the first type of integration is that you have some initial investment in terms of training the voice engine to understand what do I mean by these kind of complex questions. And in terms of transcription, the challenge is in terms of specialized vocabulary. Say, for example, if Sophia wants to be able to enter medical terms, the application may not necessarily, the voice translation, the voice to text may not necessarily understand all the medical terminology. And so there is a process, again, just like in the first case, you have to train the engine to understand specialized queries. Here you have to train the engine to understand vocabulary. So, but it's not, they are all doable, accessible technologies, very reasonable in costs. And so there's absolutely no reason why we should not use voice. But as you can see in these demos, right, the user experience that you can get by just simple voice integration is tremendous, right? Users, we have experienced this with traditional applications by just putting voice on top. It has made such a big difference to just simple being able to search for simple things. And training is not one time. You can just keep improving things when you say, oh, a user asked for something and it did not really respond the way it wanted to. You can always train the system to learn new things, right? So that's basically what I think is the real opportunity and limitations of the technology.
That's great, Ash. Thanks so much for that insight. In fact, there's a question that came in that's slightly related to this. Let me bring that up. So the question was, why has voice really not made a big presence yet? Is it because of the technology maturity? And I know that you already started covering some of these in your responses, but if you could just double click on that. So the question was, is it because of the technology maturity, or is it due to regulation, or just plain simple rigidity to change? And Sophia, would love to get your comment, and Joe, yours as well, on the regulation side of this. But from a tech perspective, Ash, if you could just cover the maturity part of the question. Is it got to the point where it's mature enough, and you don't see a reason why it cannot see a higher trajectory in terms of adoption voice?
Yeah, the reason I wanted to give these demos is to just illustrate that there are simple enough use cases that can have tremendous value addition in applications without trying to make it overly complex. I think the big secret in making voice successful in applications is not to overpromise and underdeliver. The chatbot is a formula for overpromise and underdeliver, because you're creating an expectation that the chatbot will behave like a human being, and there's just no way that it can match up to that expectation, right? But if you create a simple enough interface and say, see, I am dumb, I can just understand simple commands, but they're still way more useful than me going and clicking around in the menus and, looking for features in the application. So absolutely, as long as we are clear about what voice can do today with the technology, both data entry as well as data query capabilities of traditional applications can be done by using natural language or voice.
Got it. Joe or Sophia, comments on the regulatory aspects of it. Is there anything that limits the use of voice today?
So it's actually an interesting point, because Joe and I had a conversation about this yesterday when we were talking about it. And I think we may disagree a little bit about which one we think is. I think both are issues as to why it hasn't really made a presence in healthcare, both the rigidity to change and the regulatory board. But I think that it's more the rigidity to change. I think you have a generation that didn't necessarily grow up with the iPhone or the Alexa or the Siri device, and they're a little bit more hesitant. Like when I've talked to my more senior partners about, if I put an Alexa in the operating room, would you use it to play the music, and they're like, no, that's okay, I'm good. Or, you know, where I talk to, you know, someone that's in my generation, I'm like, hey, should we put an Alexa in here so we can listen to some music in the operating room? They're like, oh, that's a great idea. So I think that, you know, I think there's a generational gap, which that gap is going to close very soon, because, you know, almost everyone has, you know, a smartphone or, you know, a tablet or something, Alexa, Siri, everyone knows. I mean, every commercial has that in there. And I do think there is a good portion of regulation. Like Joe mentioned earlier, you know, healthcare is one of the most protected entities. We have such, you know, laws to protect patient privacy data, patient healthcare data. You know, everything is, you know, a HIPAA violation, which means, you know, if you tell somebody that, you can get in trouble for that. And, you know, the biggest example of why this is a problem is hospitals to hospital can't communicate about the same patient there's no universal record of a patient. So a patient goes to hospital A and then they leave, and 2 weeks later they go to hospital B. Hospital A and hospital B don't communicate with each other without, you know, there's no universal way that they know that every hospital knows everything that's happened to this patient. And that's part of the regulation. That's how strictly regulated it is. And we've had hospitals for how long, but there's just so many stringent things on it.
Yeah, and I could just add to that. You make a good point, Sophia. I mean, the interoperability of patient data is such a challenge in healthcare for creating technologies that streamline. Going back to the regulation versus rigidity, and Sophia and I, we're probably not that far off in what we think, but, you know, I think the rigidity is a byproduct of the regulation. I think that just healthcare in general deals with regulation, and with that, you know, a lot of litigation challenges, and whether it's over litigated or regularly, or the appropriate amount of litigation is a debate for another time. There's just such a sensitivity to bring in new technologies, especially when when you think about voice and ambient listening. There's just a natural, you know, you want to protect that a little bit. And Sophia makes a good point. It's probably more so with the older generation. I do think the younger generation coming up is a little bit more comfortable with that, because they've seen firsthand as they've grown up the value that it can deliver. And I think that's really important. And I think we're getting there. And Ash, you make a great point around overpromise and underdeliver. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. We're getting to that point a little bit, I'm afraid, in healthcare where, I mean, artificial intelligence, machine learning is talked about, you know, all the time now in healthcare, probably a few years behind the other industries. But we have to be careful that we don't set ourselves up for underpromise and overdeliver. That's one of the things that, as a firm believer in these technologies that can really, you know, revolutionize the healthcare ecosystem, that's what I worry about. Is, are we going to overpromise AI and ML to where surgeons are going to think they're going to be having robots operating for them in 5 years? Because that's just not going to happen. We have a long way to go until we're there. So I think it's a great question. Regulation versus rigidity. Easy way out is a little bit of both, but I would say the rigidity is a little bit of a byproduct from the regulation and litigation.
Yeah, I think regulations and compliance has one of the big technical limitations. One of the big technical limitations in voice technology today is identification or authentication is not yet possible with purely voice, right? So your systems yet cannot recognize an individual just by using voice. You still need thumbprint, you need face recognition is matured. Thumbprint is of course very, very mature, but voice-based identification is not yet feasible. And that's one of the limitations where, you know, even Alexa and all of these devices have only limited capabilities of identifying individual voices. So that's very nascent. Until that really matures, you know, you cannot really do anything which is in a scenario where multiple users coexist. You know, voice becomes a limit. That becomes a serious limitation of voice today.
Again, completely agreeing with that. Is even to put a simple order to let someone have a diet, I have to, you know, sign into the computer twice, putting in my login ID, and then the order gets signed, and then I have to say, are you sure you want this order? And that's just to say the patient can have a sandwich for lunch. So you can only imagine the regulation that happens when you have to, you know, put a medication in or anything like that. And this is just like, hey, the nurse called, she wants to know if she can feed the patient, and it takes me, you know, I gotta do this, I gotta do that, I gotta do that. And, another thing about how face recognition has made a long progress, it's also, I think, a little bit in its infancy as well, especially now with the COVID generation. Everyone's wearing masks. My face recognition, I'm constantly pulling my mask down. And so now I have to create a new facial recognition with my mask on. And I don't know if it's capable to only really, it's working basically on my eyes now. So, I'll be in the operating room and, somebody will be asking to turn my phone on and I'm trying to tell them it's, 21557. And they're like, oh, 25517. And I'm like, no, wait, hang on. And then they're like, oh, we'll use your face. And they're bringing it all over. They're trying to catch the face. And I'm like, I bring my mask. It's not quite there yet. So exactly what you're saying, like it's mature, but there's still a long way even for that to go. So let alone a noisy operating room trying to authenticate something with a voice while there's 7 other people talking, music, and whatever else is going on in the operating room. It's, it is a limitation for it.
Absolutely, very, very, very interesting. So just slightly changing gears into another question that has come in more from a technology selection perspective. So the question is, what would be or what should be the criteria to decide on either building an in-house or a buy customized voice technology? So how do you decide that? What should be the criteria? What should be the thought process? Another related question was, are there certain industries that are more suited to voice than others? So if you could just address those 2 parts of the question.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it first. I think if we look at what are the technologies that you need to buy or build to implement voice-based applications, I think the key is there are three primary technologies that are involved in voice applications. The first is when a user speaks, you need to convert the speech into text. So there's a speech to text engine. The second is once you convert it into text language, you need to understand the language. So that is called natural language processing, or NLP. There's the second component. And the third component is that the system has to respond back to you using language or voice. Then there is a text to voice. So these are the 3 primary technologies. The next is, as part of the NLP or natural language processing is also a structured training process of that process to be able to say, hey, I want you to understand a certain type of conversation, right? Now, the training aspect is different from the underlying engine. So training is customized, but the underlying engine is standard. So when you decide to whether build or buy, there's almost no choice in the fact that you have to train the underlying engine. Okay, so I don't think voice-based solutions are mature enough to be able to say, hey, I have pre-trained models in certain industries. There may be some initial movement there, but most applications that need to implement voice need to do their own training. So the training bit of whether it is training of specialized structured conversations or commands or search queries, or in transcription, the custom vocabularies have to be custom built. So they cannot be. The transcription engine can be used or bought, but you cannot really, buy custom vocabularies out of the box. I think medical vocabularies Amazon has got, but they are not specialized. They are generic medical vocabularies. So when it comes to building voice capabilities in your application, there are 2 sides to it. One is, let me first address, what are these underlying engines? I said that, voice to text, natural language processing, text to voice, and transcription capabilities. All of these are capabilities that require significant investments in the AI models, which require large amount of data for those engines to really understand different languages, different dialects, different accents. And that is only possible when you have deep pockets like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, or IBM, right? And these are the 4 primary vendors of cloud-hosted, voice-based technologies. It's almost impossible to match the amount of investment they have. So it's, I think, in my view, it's pointless to try and recreate what they have done. But whatever you do, build on top of it. I don't think it is worth buying a chatbot service, for example. You may as well build it because underlying technologies are so mature today that And merely a chatbot is, like I talked earlier, is not going to really cut it. So you have to integrate voice deeper into your application. And so some amount of custom development is required. And I don't think any out-of-the-box solution will really cut it.
Joe or Sophia, any additional comments on this?
Yeah, I can just, and Ash is certainly the authority on a conversation like this, but to just kind of build on that in the healthcare industry, I think the training part is so key, right? I think as you mentioned, Amazon has a pretty robust but a general medical dictionary, right? I think it's how do you build on that to create, what are you creating within subspecialization, and what's the needs in that. So can you take that out of the box and then build on it? And the training component, we talk a lot about more from the computer vision end, but garbage in, garbage out. It's all about the quality of your data, right? That's such a key. So it's those considerations. But Ash, I thought you said it very, very well. Not much to add to what you said.
So I tried an experiment where I told Alexa to take a note and in our house, and I read like an operative report, which is just the medical jargon that I would write in the chart, and I just read one of my notes to Alexa, and she just couldn't she couldn't even do the first portion of it, because it was like I said femoral endarterectomy, and it came out to like far away rock throwing, and I was like, that's not what I was saying at all. So there is a limitation because she wasn't taught a medical dictionary. In the medical field, we have a couple of voice-to-text transcription services. And even still today, I make a phone call, I speak, and then there's a transcriptionist, a person who's listening on the other end, and they spend 20 minutes typing out what it is, and they send it back in my inbox. The ones that are there it's Dragon has one, and they write, it's Dragon Medical, but even that has its limitations. You have, a lot of the complaints that people have is you say something and then you're spending backspace to change what you said, because you're like, no, I didn't say it that way. And so, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of creating even that first step that Ash was talking about, is getting the voice to text, even with these out of the box programs that exist.
Yeah, Sophia brought up a very important thing that I mentioned earlier, which is custom vocabulary. I just want to demonstrate one quick process. What do you mean by training, right? So let's say the system was translating what I said in some text like this. And what I want to say is that, hey, actually, I did not mean give me, okay? What I want is whatever, or something like that. Right? And then I need to train the system to say, next time I say something which sounds like give me, I actually meant Jim, right? So this is what is meaning of training. And this is a painful process where, you have to be able to train the system piece by piece, to be able to say, when I say something, it means this, right? And this process of actually capturing that voice, and this training it remembers, behind the scene, this remembers what you said in terms of voice, right? And what it did in terms of conversion from voice to text. And internally, it is going to record this data to say what I meant, I pull out the piece of voice and then match it to what text you entered here. And then I need to train the underlying engine. So, this kind of capability is something, of course, again, shameless promotion here, but Accion certainly has invested a lot of effort in building some of these capabilities, which we of course, again, this is not out of the box solution, right? This needs custom development, yes, but you don't have to start from scratch. There are companies like Accion who have invested significant amount of R&D to be able to build these capabilities that can easily be integrated into applications. But it's still, I wouldn't call it a standard solution. It needs to be custom built. It needs to be customized. We don't have to start from scratch for sure.
Ash, that's a great segue into a couple of questions that came in on basically how do you go about building it, right? One of the big challenges with the most emerging technologies is everyone knows it needs to be done, whether we're talking AI, whether we're talking voice. A bunch of people asked about how do I go about doing this? does Accion Labs have any kind of structure framework that you can engage with customers or prospects to sort of help them in that journey?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I want to ensure we understand this is not rocket science. Okay, this is very straightforward. We need to be able to identify common questions that users will ask our applications. Right? That's the first starting point to say, as a user, and this is standard part of any UX workshop that you would do, right? When you're designing the user experience, analyzing user experience for any application, that the first thing you would ask the question is, what are your pain points that users want to be able to address, right? But in classic UX, you never ask this question. So how do you ask the question, right? You just say, what's your pain point and what are you looking for and what information you're looking for, but you don't bother asking the question about how do you ask that question? What is the language that you use to ask that question? I think we have to go do that due diligence to be able to record conversational intents of users as part of user experience analysis. So when we do user experience analysis, conversations need to become an extension of user experience analysis for any application, that we explicitly record what kind of conversations user would like to have. Because the biggest problem in implementing voice is being able to predict how users are going to ask questions to our applications, right? So I think that's the key starting point, that even if we are able to document and create a relatively comprehensive document of what kind of questions users are going to be able to ask. Most applications have these FAQs. It's just, imagine this is an extension of FAQ, right? That you not only ask the question in one way, every question may have 10 different ways to ask the same question. And for us to create that kind of a document or a repository of questions that users are going to ask is the starting point, because that defines the character, just like a user interface defines the character of your application in traditional interfaces. The conversations that users are going to have with your applications form the character of your application as far as voice or natural language is concerned. And so that's the starting point to just create a vocabulary for your application. Once the vocabulary is created, translating the vocabulary into technology is relatively straightforward, right? And it's not a one-time exercise. You may not get all the conversations up front. You have to keep training the system again and again. So the starting point is the design of the conversation, and then implementing the conversation as part of interface is the second part. But I mentioned earlier that the common bottleneck that we find in implementing voice for traditional applications is that the data is not in a good shape, right? So if the data is still siloed and it's all in different places and not properly connected, so that's the other initiative that needs to be undertaken to actually implement proper search, text-based search capabilities in your application. And the third thing I would say is not mandatory but always advisable is to think about proactive notifications. Now, most applications have notifications which come up as just icons or bell icons and stuff, and you have to click and read the notification, or you have mobile-based push notifications. But those kind of notifications also need to be thought from a perspective of conversations rather than merely text.
Got it. I know again we are at the top of the hour, so again I wanted to thank all the panelists here. Great conversation. I think we've covered a lot of the questions that have come in. Just for the benefit of everyone on the call, just wanted to quickly introduce. So Accion Labs is a product engineering services company. We've got 3,000 plus engineers across 16 global offices. Voice, the assets that you saw today are a big part of sort of our focus on innovation. Following this webinar, you'll be receiving an email from our teams with our contact details. We're happy to offer, a 1-hour workshop to sort of evaluate, to the points that Ash was talking about towards the end, these aspects of how you can integrate voice into your applications. So feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to schedule those workshops and evaluate how voice can be integrated into your applications. Again, thank you so much everyone for attending, and thank you so much to the panelists, Sophia, Joe, Ash. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.